My film archive is on the 1979 film The Driller Killer, and I'm discussing and exploring the ways in which this film has been discursively constructed as a deviant object. So I'm going to go over the ways in which that's been done since its release. So before I get started discussing the deviance of the film, I just want to talk a little bit about some of the material conditions of its production and offer a brief film synopsis so we all know sort of what I'm talking about. This is Abel Ferrara's second feature-length film. His first was actually a pornographic film that came out in 1976. It was filmed sporadically between 77 and 79 as time and money allowed. It began, actually, funnily enough, as a documentary project about the homeless population in the Lower East Side where Ferrara and his collaborators lived. And as they secured funding from a pornography producer named Arthur Weisberg, who gave them in spurts about $70,000 to make the film, they turned some of the stock footage they had into The Driller Killer. Ferrara plays the lead role under the pseudonym Jimmy Lane. And most of the actors, like Ferrara, are non-professionals. The scenes are all improvised, and the script was generated procedurally and collaboratively. Most of it is shot in a friend's apartment, who also stars in the film under the name Douglas Metroff. And it's about an artist who lives in the Lower East Side. He's a struggling poor guy, and he's kind of driven to madness by a bunch of different factors. The sort of final straw, he's broke. He's worried that his girlfriend is going to leave him. The final straw is a punk band moves in next door and just like practices super loud all day and night. And he runs out and starts killing people with a drill when he breaks from the pressure. So obviously, being what it is about, the film is a little bit of a deviant object from the go. It's often considered a slasher film, whatever. One of the things that I think is interesting about it, though, is that it opens with this screen. This film should be played loud. And to me, this speaks to Ferrara's attitude about the Lower East Side. And it's a place that he's obviously sort of in love with. As you watch The Driller Killer, this becomes evident. But this is a place where, punk rock is happening, lots of art is happening, film is happening, and it's this famously rich atmosphere. I've got here a quote from a foreword to a film history that he wrote, where he's talking about the people that were around at the time, and you see names like Jarmusch, Keith Haring. He mentions Andy Warhol here. So the Lower East Side in the 1970s is a place that Ferrara is sort of celebrating with this film. So besides being a film that had a very limited theatrical release and being a horror film, which are both things that would make it a deviant object, the primary reason I identify in my archive for the Driller Killer being an object of deviance is because of its involvement in something called the Video Nasties movement in the UK in the early 1980s. This was a censorship campaign that was spearheaded by a woman named Mary Whitehouse, and was taken up by the tabloid press and by really the press at large. And it sort of pit these horror films that were newly available on home video as these dangerous objects, things that were endangering the delicate morality of the nation's youth. So I have several pages of these rather outrageous headlines from between 1982 and 1984. So I'll just go through a couple of these. You see here video as a corrupting agent, and the Driller Killer is actually highlighted in a number of these articles. So for its association with this movement, the Driller Killer, due in large part to materials made to promote the film, it was identified and sort of one of 39 films that were essentially made illegal in the UK and thus became infamous, right? It sort of like made them these objects that people could really fetishize. The Driller Killer became one of these fetishized deviant objects because of its involvement in the Video Nasties censorship campaign. Here we see video and Video Nasties as being singled out as the cause for real world crimes. So how did the driller killer become involved in this? Well, as I said, there were complaints lodged by consumers to advertising standards boards for. On the right here, you see a magazine advertisement that was taken out by distributor Vipco in 1982 to promote the film. And on the left is its VHS clamshell case. So much of the film's materials, sort of collateral pieces that it is associated with, very much lean into this deviant status. So I have here 3 different film posters from the 1970s. 1974's Death Wish, 1976's Taxi Driver, and 1979's The Driller Killer. All 3 are focused on a single, isolated protagonist who commits acts of violence. But as we know, Taxi Driver is considered like sort of a masterpiece by a lot of people. Death Wish was a huge commercial success. It made $20 million on a $3 million budget, spawned 4 sequels, a 2018 remake. And The Driller Killer released in 20 theaters and is considered a video nasty. So this is another thing that has contributed to its status as a deviant object. I want to extend this comparison between Death Wish and The Driller Killer a little bit, and talk about the differing moralities of the 2 films. So comparing the moral codes of Reno Miller and Paul Kersey as a kind of shotgun sociological study, which is the title of a book I'll never write. Both of these films take place in New York in the mid 70s. And as I said before, Ferrara sort of celebrates the Lower East Side and the New York scene in The Driller Killer. And Death Wish takes the other angle. This is something from my archive that I found. It was put out by something called the Council for Public Safety in 1975. And it's called Welcome to Fear City. And it's basically a survival guide for tourists that says, like, don't go outside after 6 p.m. and never leave your hotel room and don't walk anywhere, because street crime was high in the mid 70s. There was a lot of homelessness. There was a lot of street crime. There was a lot of mob crime. The city went broke in the mid 1970s. So the fear city that Death Wish takes place in is, geographically the same place as The Driller Killer, but the way it's constructed, it's a much different place. It's a place where people can't walk down the street without getting mugged. And of course, Paul Kersey in Death Wish responds to these violent streets by taking up arms against them, right? He goes out and plays possum for all kinds of muggers and kills them. So I'm going to compare the morality of these 2 protagonists. So in The Driller Killer, we have Reno Miller. He's a bohemian artist guy, right? He's in a non-traditional relationship and living arrangement. He has a girlfriend, and his girlfriend has a girlfriend who is not also his girlfriend. He has a very blasé attitude toward violence, which we'll see an example of in a video clip in just a second. He has middle-class aspirations. He wants to become a successful painter and make lots of money, and he has mental health struggles. Also, if you ever see the movie, you'll know he's a multiple murderer, and he eats pizza in a way that's like super gross. So this poem, which Ferrara also quotes in the foreword I mentioned earlier, it just sort of talks about his love for the Lower East Side and sort of being in this violent place where things are happening. And this poem really sort of represents Reno Miller / Abel Ferrara for me.
Ernesto Williamson, a 50-year-old truck driver, broke down and wept as he talked about his son Louis, who was accused of hijacking a bus and killing 2 people. All his life he's been depressed, always been down. He's a very emotional boy. I like the 44 killer better.
So we see, by the way, Reno responds to this story that, as I said, he has a blasé attitude toward violence. He's not somebody who's afraid of it, but is sort of in it. By comparison, Death Wish's Paul Kersey is possessed of entirely different morality. In the opening scene, his wife and daughter suffer a horrific home invasion attack. But prior to this, he's very much a traditional middle class family man, right? He's an architect. He's got a good job. He's a former conscientious objector. It explains quite thoroughly at the beginning of the film. And as he begins to, take to the streets with his gun, we see his politics shifting away from that passive, conscientious objector to a proactive, violent vigilante hero. So the morality of Paul Kersey is quite melodramatic in comparison to that of the more diffuse morality of Reno Miller. Those who have seen or see Death Wish will, of course, also know that Paul Kersey becomes a multiple murderer as a sort of anonymous vigilante in defense of the middle class. So the opposing perspectives and moralities of these two films bear some differences that are similar to the differences between the primitive narrative films of D.W. Griffith and Oscar Micheaux. This is not to say that these films are doing the same cultural work as their forebears, but rather that their formal approaches are sort of mirrored in this comparison. While Birth of a Nation, like Death Wish, favors a linear simplicity in order to deliver a melodramatic allegory, Within Our Gates, just like The Driller Killer, employs more complex, non-traditional editing and a more complex, non-traditional morality to deliver, a more diffuse moral message. Like Anna Siamopoulos writes in the article that we read earlier this semester, the complicated style of Micheaux's editing works to constitute a spectator who is more politically critical than the spectator constructed by the classical Hollywood style of Griffith's film. So too do these two films construct audiences with varying values, where The Driller Killer is obviously still Reno Miller is still a violent murderer, but his lifestyle and the sort of version of New York that he inhabits is a much more morally diffuse version of New York, and he's a much more morally diffuse protagonist than Paul Kersey's New York. Paul Kersey's New York is quite literally very black and white, just like his morality, the violence of his morality. And while Death Wish doesn't directly support notions of white supremacy or encourage violence against Black people as expressly as The Birth of a Nation, its depiction of class relations and righteous violence betrays echoes of Griffith's racist film, Birth of a Nation. The Driller Killer contains no content expressly dealing with racism, of course. But like Within Our Gates, its non-traditional form stands in opposition to institutional products like Death Wish, demanding an engaged and thoughtful spectator to discern conflicting and contradictory social and political claims about the power structure in the United States, as once again Anna Siamopoulos writes. And that's it. I hope that this made sense. I hope that I was able to unearth a little bit about the construction of The Driller Killer as a deviant object because of its association with the Video Nasties movement, because of some of the promotional materials that the film used, and because of its complex and diffuse and non-traditional morality.